This is Israel, the Promised Land, which many imagine as a place of abundance and peace. But the truth is very different. Most of the people who lived there before biblical times died before the age of 30. Reality was harsh, and the daily struggle for survival was constant. Water, the essential source of life, was rare and precious. Entire families fought fiercely over a single well, as if it were the most valuable treasure. The scarcity of resources was only part of the suffering. The social and religious system was relentless. Breaking even a simple religious law could result in severe punishments, with public stoning being the most common sentence. How could a place called the land flowing with milk and honey actually be one of the most hostile environments of the ancient world? And even more, why did millions of people choose to live there, facing adversity with courage and unshakable faith? The answer lies in Israel's strategic location and geographic conditions, but also in the dark secret that few mention. Israel was located at the crossroads of 3 continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. A meeting point for civilizations and empires, where trade routes crossed and the destinies of peoples were forged. This was a land of great contrasts, a geopolitical battlefield that for centuries would shape the course of the ancient world. But what many don't know is that the Promised Land was, in reality, a brutal and arid place, a desert disguised as hope. The landscape was dry and unforgiving. The land stretched into vast deserts, such as the Negev desert in the south, where the scorching heat burned everything in its path. The north, in contrast, offered a brief relief with the hills of Galilee, where olive trees and vineyards managed to survive, but not without difficulty. In summer, the heat was unbearable. Temperatures often exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, with the sun blazing over the dry earth, rendering it almost barren. Rain, when it fell, was rare and never enough to ease the water shortage that plagued the region. During winter, the climate became somewhat milder, but rainfall was still scarce, and water sources rarely sustained the population. Traveling between cities was a huge challenge. The roads were narrow and dangerous, and a journey from Jerusalem to Galilee could take an entire week. It was an uncertain journey, filled with risks. The threat of bandits and wild animals lurking made any trip a true gamble with life. And then there was water, the most precious and disputed resource. The Promised Land, described as flowing with milk and honey, was thirsty, and without water, survival was impossible. Wells were more valuable than gold, and any cistern built required meticulous care, for within it lay life itself. Cisterns were not merely reservoirs, but fortresses against death and despair. The irony of life in the Promised Land is devastating. For many, wine diluted with water was the daily drink, not for pleasure, but for necessity. Pure water was often contaminated and unfit for consumption, making wine a safer, though bitter, alternative when diluted. This was the reality for those trying to live there, a constant game between faith, endurance, and the fight for survival. And yet, millions tried to live, work, raise children, and keep their faith intact. Amid all this, a chosen people believed that the promise of a land of abundance made by God was not just a distant vision, but a reality to be conquered. For many, it was a test of faith, a proof of perseverance in the face of insurmountable difficulties. It was life woven through suffering and adversity in a land where every day could be the last. It was here, in this inhospitable and challenging setting, that the history of the people of Israel unfolded. A land that promised blessings but demanded blood, sweat, and tears just to see the next sunrise. This was the harsh reality of those living in the Promised Land. Each day began with the fight for survival, and the simple act of waking up was a challenge. It was the start of a daily journey in which physical and mental effort intertwined, where every movement was marked by the need to keep breathing, to live another day. Waking up in an Israelite home was not a choice, but a decision of faith and survival. The dawn, with the sunrise around 6 a.m., was a constant. There was no luxury in daily life. The sun was not just a natural phenomenon, but a gift of time that could not be wasted. Every ray of light brought the chance to work, to produce, to fight for subsistence. It was a matter of survival. The day only had value while the sun was in the sky, because the night was long and treacherous, and the darkness of the promised land often meant the risk of death. The daily work of an Israelite revolved around three essential activities, frequently mentioned in the Bible: farming, shepherding, and, in the north, around the Sea of Galilee, fishing. These were the activities that sustained life and fed families, yet all were bound to one relentless enemy: the lack of water. Every minute of sunlight, every hour of the day was dedicated to the continuous effort of finding food and sustenance. In the life of fishermen, as we see in Mark 1:16, where Jesus calls Simon and Andrew, the brothers who were fishermen, it is interesting to note that these men worked on the waters of the Sea of Galilee, a region which, as beautiful and fertile as it was, still depended on careful management of its natural resources. But what many don't realize is how much the scarcity of water shaped every aspect of daily life. Water was not a luxury, it was survival itself. And cisterns, described in Jeremiah 2:13, were the great heroines of this struggle. Rock-hewn reservoirs, deep pits carved to collect and store rainwater. The life of every family literally depended on how much rain had fallen the previous winter. These cisterns were not merely a physical component of daily life, but a direct reflection of the constant battle to stay alive. What most people don't realize is that this scarcity of water even influenced clothing. Everyday attire was simple and practical. The Bible describes the use of linen tunics and leather sandals, garments that became symbols of humility and necessity. In Matthew 10:10, Jesus mentions that it was unnecessary to carry an extra tunic when traveling because the simplicity of their clothing made life more functional and efficient. Food was also a reflection of this austere reality. Bread was the true staple, the foundation of every meal. In Matthew 6:11, in the famous Our Daily Bread, we see a testimony to this essential dependence. Each family ground wheat at home using a stone hand mill, an arduous process that consumed hours of work every day. Meat, on the other hand, was a rarity. As seen in the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15, killing a fattened calf to celebrate the return of the lost son was an extraordinary occasion. Meat was a luxury, a special dish reserved for truly important events. Then came the Sabbath, the sacred day of rest. The truth about the Sabbath is, in itself, shocking. It was taken so seriously that breaking its rules could result in the death penalty, as stated in Exodus 31:14. On the Sabbath, one could not light a fire, carry a load, or even walk long distances. Israelite society was deeply marked by faith and the need to obey divine commandments, with the certainty that any violation of these laws was not merely a social offense, but an affront to God Himself. What kept this people going under such harsh and difficult conditions? The answer, once again, lay in their absolute faith that this land had a divine purpose. Despite being one of the most challenging regions in the ancient world, where every day was a fight for survival, the belief that God had promised this land as an inheritance to His people gave them strength to carry on. Faith sustained them, the certainty that all the hardships and challenges they faced would be rewarded by the divine presence that guided and protected each believer. And in the end, that land, which seemed cruel and unyielding, became the stage where some of the greatest acts of faith in history were forged, where survival was intertwined with belief in a higher divine purpose. But this faith would be tested even more intensely when the people of Israel reached the most important and contradictory city in the biblical world, Jerusalem. Can you imagine a day of the week when, if you worked, you could literally lose your life? In biblical Israel, the Sabbath was not just a day of rest, it was a matter of life or death. Exodus 31:14 makes this absolutely clear. You shall keep the Sabbath. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. This was not merely a religious command, but a rule so strict that it transcended both spiritual and social boundaries. The Sabbath completely transformed the life of the Israelites, beginning at sunset on Friday and lasting until sunset on Saturday. During those 24 hours, daily activities were reduced to an almost absolute minimum. Lighting a fire was forbidden, so all food had to be prepared in advance. Carrying a load was prohibited, even a small one. No one could walk more than about 1 kilometer from their home. The Sabbath imposed a deep silence, a stillness that covered the whole land of Israel, with every movement controlled, life itself becoming an act of obedience and reverence toward divine law. But while the Sabbath set the rhythm of daily life, the center of Israel's religious and spiritual life was in a place even more impressive, the Temple of Jerusalem. The temple was not merely a place of prayer, but the absolute heart of Israel's social, economic, and spiritual existence. All dimensions of Israelite life converged there, often in intense contradictions. The temple was not only a place of devotion, but also a commercial hub, a court of law, and even a slaughterhouse, all in one. And when we speak of a slaughterhouse, the description is literal. Sacrifices took place constantly and on a massive scale. During Passover, for example, historians estimate that around 250,000 lambs were sacrificed within just a few days. The smell of blood and burning meat filled the air around the temple, becoming an inescapable feature of life for anyone living nearby or passing through. In 2 Kings 16:13, we find detailed descriptions of the different types of daily sacrifices performed at the temple: burnt offerings, grain offerings, and drink offerings. The noise was deafening, the bleating of animals, the loud prayers, the constant crackle of fire. For Israelite children, this environment was familiar from their earliest years. They grew up breathing the atmosphere of sacrifices, rituals, and devotion. As described in Deuteronomy 6:6-7, children were taught to memorize the Torah, to speak of it at all times. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. For them, the Word of God was not a distant theory or a vague tradition. It was lived intensely every day, a manual for life, a constant presence in every thought and every action. Imagine 5- or 6-year-old children reciting entire psalms from memory, knowing every law, every ritual, every religious feast in detail. Religious education began long before they could even walk steadily or fully understand the world around them. The strictness of religious life was absolute. The Israelites believed with complete conviction that they were God's chosen people, living in the Promised Land, and this certainty sustained them amid the hardships and severity of their existence. And at the heart of this rigid and deeply religious world was a city that concentrated all this faith and hope in an even more intense and contradictory way. Jerusalem was the city that embodied both the best and the worst of humanity's relationship with the divine. Can you imagine a city where the smell of blood mixed with incense dominated the air every single day? Jerusalem, in the time of Jesus, was exactly that. A holy city, yet also an immense religious slaughterhouse. The first thing that impressed visitors was the grand architecture of Jerusalem. The city was built in layers, with stone houses stacked upon one another, connected by endless stairways. And as Luke 19:41 describes, Jesus wept when he saw the city from above, reflecting on its fate. From a distance, one saw a majestic city, dominated by the figure of the temple rising in splendor, commanding the entire skyline. This temple, built by Herod, was one of the most magnificent structures of the ancient world. It was the center of all attention, the place where religious traditions and sacrifices intertwined with the daily lives of a deeply devout people. Yet, even as it stood as a symbol of unshakable faith, it was also the site where human contradictions were laid bare, where the blood of animals mingled with incense, and where, under the shadow of holiness, the suffering of endless sacrifices continued without pause. But here is what few realize. Ordinary people never had access to the temple itself. They were confined to the outer courts. The Temple of Jerusalem, with all its grandeur, was a place reserved for a few. For the common people, the temple was a distant place of worship, with the poorest pushed to the outer edges, never allowed into the heart of holiness. Biblical Jerusalem was a city of brutal contrasts, a place where the sacred and the profane coexisted in a visible, painful way. In the markets, everything was for sale: spices from India, fabrics from Egypt, jewels from Arabia. Commerce bustled at every moment. Mark 11:15-17 records the moment when Jesus drove the merchants out of the temple courts, accusing them of turning what should be a sacred space into a marketplace. But for every prosperous merchant, there were dozens of beggars at the gates, living in misery. Luke 16:20 tells of Lazarus, a beggar covered in sores, who lived at the gate of a rich man, a reflection of the sad reality of many in Jerusalem, where wealth and poverty existed side by side, separated by an invisible, impenetrable line. Everywhere, Roman soldiers patrolled. They stood on street corners, monitored the markets, collected taxes with violence, and spread fear. Matthew 5:41 refers to the Roman law that allowed soldiers to force any Jew to carry their baggage for 1 mile. And this was no metaphor, but an actual law, a daily and systematic humiliation for the Jewish people. Imagine the suffering of a poor Jewish vendor trying to sell his fruit at the market while a Roman soldier passed by, mocking his goods. It was constant humiliation, the power of the oppressor over the oppressed. The social hierarchy was clearly visible. Priests, with their colorful and ornate garments, walked through the center of the city, while ordinary people wore simple, faded tunics. The social distance between them was not just a matter of status. It was a matter of life and death, of who had the right to human dignity and who was treated as property. But if all this already sounds cruel, the worst was yet to come when it came to daily life in Jerusalem. Where did people relieve themselves? Public latrines were rare. Most of the population used areas outside the city walls, turning the surroundings of Jerusalem into a permanent, unsanitary zone, a land of filth and suffering. During days of extreme heat, families would go up to the flat rooftops of their houses to sleep. Acts 10:9 mentions Peter praying on the rooftop of a house, and it was common practice to use these spaces as extra rooms during the intense summer heat. Life in Jerusalem was marked by extreme contrasts. The sacred and the profane mingled, wealth and poverty side by side, faith and oppression walking the same stone-paved streets. And if you thought the social tensions of Jerusalem were intense, wait until you discover how Israelite society really functioned, and how being born into the right family or the wrong gender could determine not only your future, but even your humanity. Did you know that in biblical Israel, the social group you were born into determined whether you would be treated as a human being or as property? Israelite society was divided into rigid layers, and crossing those barriers was impossible. At the top of the pyramid were the Sadducees, the religious elite who controlled the temple and its sacred practices. They were the only ones with direct access to the holiest rituals, and not coincidentally were also the wealthiest. Acts 5:17 shows us how the Sadducees persecuted any threat to their power and influence. They were in charge, and their wealth and authority were not only financial, but also spiritual. Just below them came the Pharisees, a group Matthew 23 verse 5 describes as people who make their phylacteries broad and the fringes long, obsessed with displaying their religiosity in public, a spectacle of faith that often hid hypocrisy. They saw themselves as the legitimate religious authority, but in reality, they were more concerned with appearances than with true transformation of the heart. For most of the population, however, farmers, fishermen, artisans, life was very different. They worked hard with little to sustain their families, and their faith was often a refuge amid the daily struggle for survival. But for women, reality was even more tragic. From birth, they were subjected to an oppressive patriarchal system in which their words had no legal value. They could not testify in court, and formal religious education in the synagogues was forbidden to them. Women were viewed as property, and their lives were often defined by arranged marriages at the age of 12 or 13. These marriages were not personal choices, but commercial transactions between families, as seen implicitly in Matthew 1:18, where Mary was already betrothed to Joseph. For women, life was a continuous fight for dignity and respect in a world that saw them as inferior, as commodities rather than human beings. When a woman was caught in adultery, the reality was brutal. John 8:4-5 shows how she was publicly dragged out to be stoned to death. But there is something even more perverse in this story. Only the woman was brought to justice. The man involved was rarely punished. Gender inequality was blatant and cruel. Women were seen as property, and their lives could be destroyed by a single mistake, while men, with rare exceptions, escaped punishment. But women were not the only victims of this cruel system. Widows, in particular, were exposed to social humiliation. Mark 12:40 denounces the scribes, those religious leaders who devour widows' houses. When a husband died, many women were literally abandoned by society, without inheritance, without protection, and without dignity. They were left at the mercy of anyone and often ended up living in absolute poverty. The treatment of widows in Israelite society was a reflection of the deep contempt for the fragility and vulnerability of women. Now, if being a woman was already difficult, being a Samaritan was even worse. The Samaritans were considered impure, traitors to the Jewish faith, half Jewish, half Gentile. They were seen as a marginalized people, rejected by Jewish traditions. John 4:9 describes the astonishment of the Samaritan woman when speaking to Jesus. "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. There was total segregation. The Jews avoided traveling through Samaritan lands, detouring their routes so as not to touch the contaminated soil. Sharing food or drink with a Samaritan was seen as spiritual defilement. This racial and religious divide was severe and almost impossible to overcome. And at the very bottom of the social pyramid were the poor, the masses who survived from day to day with no guarantees, no hope. Luke 16:19-21 paints this harsh and inescapable reality. While some were clothed in purple and fine linen, others, like Lazarus, lay covered with sores, longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. The gap between social classes was not only economic, but also a matter of basic human dignity. For the poor, daily survival was a battle against humiliation, hunger, and inequality. While the elite lived in luxury, crumbs of bread were the only hope for the most needy. But all this social oppression became even more brutal when you realized who truly ruled Israel. The ones who really controlled the people's lives were not the religious leaders or the local nobles, but the Romans, who had imposed a foreign occupation that turned Israel into a puppet state completely submissive to Rome. Life under Roman occupation was a hell of heavy taxes and constant humiliation. Imagine living in a country where foreign soldiers could force you to carry their luggage whenever they pleased. This was the daily reality for Jews under Roman rule. Matthew 5:41 records the words of Jesus, "If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2." This was not just spiritual advice, but a matter of practical survival. What Jesus was saying was that if you wanted to avoid being humiliated or punished, you should comply with the oppressor's demands and even go beyond what was required to prevent further abuse. The truth is, the Romans turned Israel into a submissive nation where the people's dignity was at the mercy of foreign authorities. Taxes were brutal and humiliating, levied on practically everything. On land, on crops, on trade, on nearly everything you owned. Matthew 17:24 mentions one of these taxes, the temple tax, but there were many others that people had to pay just to survive. And who collected these taxes? Other Jews. Luke 19:2 introduces Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector, who collected taxes for Rome, betraying his own people. Tax collectors were hated even more than the Romans themselves because they were seen as collaborators with the oppressor, exploiting their own brothers in the name of a system that oppressed them. They were traitors to the nation, seeing their own people as a source of profit to be mercilessly exploited. Imagine a Jewish farmer who had worked tirelessly all year on his small piece of land, only to see most of his harvest taken away by tax collectors. These collectors spoke the same language as he did, but served the empire that enslaved him. It was a constant cycle of oppression, a people struggling to live, while distant and relentless external forces took what rightfully belonged to them. Revolts were frequent, but they almost always ended the same way: mass crucifixion. Roman crucifixion was not just an execution, it was a tool of psychological terror. The empire used crosses to spread fear, to show who was in control. The Romans crucified rebels along major roads, so that everyone passing by would see the horrific public punishment. Josephus, the historian of the time, recounts an event so terrible that during one revolt, so many people were crucified that there was not enough wood for the crosses, nor enough crosses for the bodies. Crucifixion became a spectacle of pain and humiliation, where resistance was crushed not only physically, but also psychologically, with the body of anyone who dared challenge the empire's power left exposed to shame and suffering. Luke 13:1 mentions the Galileans, whose blood Pilate mingled with their sacrifices, a reference to a brutal massacre in the very temple during religious rituals. Roman soldiers entered the temple and slaughtered Jews while they were worshipping, staining the holy place with the blood of their own brothers. Violence was so common and so brutal that the temple, a symbol of faith and holiness, also became a scene of martyrdom and humiliation. The situation was desperate, oppression seemed endless, and the search for any sign of hope became vital. Faith, though unshaken, was tested to the limit. John 6:15 recounts that after Jesus multiplied the loaves, the hungry and oppressed crowd wanted to seize him and make him king. Why such a reaction? Because a hungry and oppressed people were desperate for any kind of deliverer. They longed for someone who could free them from hunger and pain, someone who would break the Roman yoke and restore their dignity and freedom. In this climate, false messiahs began to appear. Acts 5:36-37 mentions Theudas and Judas the Galilean, who promised liberation and gathered many followers. But like all the rest, they ended up dead, along with their followers, their promises broken, and hope once again shattered. Those who still clung to hope were not merely looking for a political or military liberator, but for the promised Messiah who would restore the kingdom of Israel. What sustained this hope was an unshakable faith that God had not abandoned his people, even in the midst of Roman soldiers' mockery, the greed of tax collectors, and the constant sight of crosses along the roads. The people of Israel believed that at some point, God would send his chosen one to deliver them from oppression and restore the kingdom. Daniel 2:44 fed this hope. The God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. This vision of an eternal kingdom free from foreign empires was the light at the end of the tunnel for millions of Jews who, when they looked at the present, saw only darkness, suffering, and slavery. But Israel's story does not end with crosses, oppression, or humiliation. Even in the midst of so much adversity, the flame of hope never went out. The Jewish people, marked by pain and resilience, kept alive the belief that one day the Messiah would come. The promise of an eternal kingdom, the restoration of Israel, was not just an idea, but a truth deeply rooted in the soul of every Israelite. And when the Messiah finally came, he did not appear as many expected, a military leader, a powerful king, or a liberator who would crush their enemies. Jesus of Nazareth came as a humble man, preaching love, peace, and salvation, but also challenging the power structures that oppressed his people. He was not the Messiah many had anticipated, but he was the Messiah God had promised. His life, death, and resurrection became the foundation of the Christian faith, and also the reaffirmation of the hope the Jewish people had always held. Jerusalem, this sacred city, yet marked by suffering, would be the stage for an event that would change the course of human history. The Messiah did not come merely to restore the physical kingdom of Israel, but to inaugurate a spiritual kingdom that would transcend borders and ages, reaching all nations. The crucifixion, which seemed like the most humiliating defeat, would in fact become the ultimate victory over death and sin. This story is not only about the suffering of a people or the promise of a deliverer. It is about the radical transformation of humanity, about how faith, hope, and love can survive even in the most desperate circumstances. Israel, the promised land, with all its contrasts, hardships, and struggles, became the cradle of a story that would touch the entire world. And so, the land that saw divine promises fulfilled, that endured the pain of the cross and the joy of the resurrection, continues to stand as a symbol of faith, resilience, and renewal. In its dry soil, at the heart of its history, a light was born, a light that still shines in every corner of the world. Because hope never dies. It renews, it resurrects, and it transforms. See you soon.